This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journeys toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 238 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow anti-diet dietitian Taylor Chan about fence-straddling between intuitive eating and traditional dietetics, and eventually jumping over to the other side of the fence, how her desire to be a quote-unquote good dietitian pulled her further into diet culture, the privilege inherent in diet culture's version of nutrition, the nuances that make intuitive eating an inclusive practice, and so much more. Can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. And just a quick note on this one that in the interview, I say that Ellen Satter's model is called attuned eating, but actually it's called eating competence. Also, this conversation with Taylor was recorded before the pandemic, which is why we don't mention anything about COVID-19 in the conversation, but this week's listener question does address it. Right now, I'm fast-tracking questions that have to do with the pandemic just to help people out during this time and help answer some really pertinent questions. But I'll likely go back and answer some older questions in the future as well. So if your question hasn't been answered yet, never fear, you might have a chance to get it answered, even if it's an older question. Speaking of this week's listener question, it is from a listener named Jane who writes, "Hi, Christy. I'm a big fan of the show and have really been enjoying your work lately as you help to dispel a lot of diet culture myths during the COVID-19 pandemic. Intuitive eating has helped me a lot over the past year, and I finally feel like I'm at peace with food, but I have some concerns at the moment. In my country, we are in lockdown, and I think the stress of this has affected my eating. I'm now experiencing pretty much a total loss of appetite. While I'm still eating 3 meals a day, it is more to do with my understanding of my body's needs than any actual hunger signals. I would also usually have several snacks a day, but now don't feel any inclination or appetite towards these. Food doesn't feel fun to me at the moment, whereas it usually is something I really enjoy. I was wondering if you might have any advice on how to eat and enjoy eating when an external stressor has completely taken away my appetite. Wishing you and your loved ones good health, happiness, and safety at this really difficult time. And again, thank you so much for all the work you do." So thanks, Jane, for that great question and for that really kind feedback. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So first of all, I just want to send so much compassion your way because it sounds like you're really struggling and you've struggled a lot in the past in your relationship with food. And I'm so glad that you've really healed a lot and done a lot of work on your intuitive eating, getting back to intuitive eating, relearning your intuitive relationship with food. But the pandemic really is throwing a lot of people off. So you're absolutely not alone. This moment of stress is affecting a lot of people's appetites and eating habits in all kinds of different ways. Some people are finding themselves eating more and having a really big appetite, or just, grazing throughout the day and not necessarily eating meals. Some people are having less of an appetite, like you describe. Some people are feeling kind of chaotic and ping-ponging between the two, and everything in between. Also, the virus itself can have really weird effects on appetite because it can take away people's sense of taste and smell, resulting in a lower appetite, less desire to eat, less pleasure in food, etc. So I think first and foremost, I think this bears saying, even if you don't think you might have the virus, that a loss of sense of taste and smell or loss of appetite could have something to do with a virus. And so if you have that plus any other symptoms, you might want to get tested. I know testing is not always available everywhere. So if you're in a country or a place that has a lack of testing, maybe it's not going to be available to you, but maybe proceed as though you do have it. I mean, honestly, all of us should be proceeding as though we do have it right now, which is what like the social distancing is all about, and wearing masks in public and not, touching our faces and all of that stuff. It's just assuming that like the virus is among us and maybe even within us. And so we need to protect others from us just as much as we need to protect ourselves from others who might be carrying it. So recognize that this is potentially a sign that you have the virus if it's accompanied by other symptoms, and maybe even if not, because, a lot of people are asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. But more importantly, I think for anyone who's struggling in their relationship with food, which is basically everyone who's listening to this podcast, right? Even if you're not actively struggling in your relationship with food right now, you probably have in some way in the past, or you work with people who do, and that's why you're interested in this content. I think for most of us, if not all of us who are listening to this show, we have a history of disordered eating, and a moment like this can be really triggering. It can sometimes trigger us back into old behaviors. So I want to say, don't let this lower appetite that you have right now become an excuse to restrict. Because I see that sometimes with people who are early in their intuitive eating process. They've recovered from more severe disordered eating, more, chronic dieting and things like that. And they've kind of been muddling along with intuitive eating and finding some peace and finding some ability to trust their hunger and fullness cues. But then something like this happens where their appetite is lowered, and that can become an inadvertent excuse to restrict. So don't let that happen to you. It's great that you're still doing self-care with food by trying to make sure you eat 3 meals a day, even though it sounds like you're not getting a lot of pleasure out of food right now. And pleasure really is such a driving force in intuitive eating for so many people. But I would say too, don't forget about snacks. Snacks are actually not optional. They're not just something to eat because they bring you pleasure and joy. They're actually necessary and important for meeting your body's needs. And not just your body's needs for pleasure, but your body's needs for energy and for nutrients. And all of those things are really important, especially during a global pandemic when our immune systems are probably working extra hard. And we want to make sure to support our immune systems. And so not restricting is a really essential piece of that. So I would say, in addition to making sure that you're eating your 3 meals, also make sure you're eating a few snacks, at least 2 snacks throughout the day, if not 3 snacks or more, just to make sure that you're not going too long without food. Because not only is that going to rob you of energy and potentially put your immune system in jeopardy, but it's also, if you go too long without eating, could start that restrict binge cycle up again that so many of us have experienced. Or for the people who are more on just the restricting side and don't have the binges in response, which is a tiny minority of people, those folks might experience an uptick in disordered thoughts and restrictive thoughts and behaviors by inadvertently restricting. And inadvertently restricting can trigger us back into disordered eating, no matter what our eating disordered behaviors were in the past. So just make sure that you're not going too long without eating by putting snacks back into your day. And yeah, they might not be super pleasurable right now. Food itself might not be super pleasurable when you don't have much of an appetite. But I think if you can continue to keep yourself eating for self-care, including meals and snacks throughout the day, that'll save you from falling into that restriction pattern that can lead to either restrict binge cycling or just full-on restriction and deprivation. And you don't want to get to that place, because that then, undoes a lot of your work or makes it harder to come back to intuitive eating after this is all over. And to the people who might think of intuitive eating as like, oh, aren't you only supposed to eat when you're hungry? Aren't you only supposed to eat when you feel an appetite or when you can take pleasure in food? The answer really is no. Intuitive eating is not just about eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full. That's what Isabel Fox and Duke calls the hunger and fullness diet. It's not even just about eating for pleasure and satisfaction, because that's like the pleasure and satisfaction diet. Intuitive eating is about eating for self-care as well. So eating, yes, to nourish and satisfy hunger, to honor your pleasure and satisfaction. Those things are super important, but so is eating for self-care, even in the absence of those other cues and desires. So make sure that you're continuing to eat for self-care so that you don't get things like, I think we talked about this a few episodes ago in the Q&A, but you can have non-stomach signs of hunger like headaches and difficulty concentrating and low energy and anxiety and depression and irritability. All of these things can be non-stomach signs of hunger, sometimes pointing to more extreme forms of hunger. But, if you're not eating enough, and that includes not eating snacks throughout the day, if you're just eating meals and probably not eating as much as you normally would for meals, you're probably going to be deprived, and you might end up with these non-stomach signs of hunger and deprivation that will then, if nothing else, just make your life harder and just make you have symptoms that don't feel so good. So I think really it's important to focus on eating for self-care right now, even if you don't have much of an appetite, even if you're sick with COVID-19 as well, and you're having respiratory symptoms that make you not as hungry, or you're having lack of taste and smell that make you not as hungry. Eating for self-care, eating regularly and consistently, and trying to eat the best you can do, trying to eat as much as you normally would, is a helpful way just to keep yourself from falling back into that restriction cycle. So I hope that's helpful. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. Then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it every month more quickly than I can here, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has a monthly Q&A podcast just for course participants, where you get to ask your own questions every month and have me answer them, and listen to hundreds of answers I've given to other people already, so that you can work through the nuances of intuitive eating and really put it into practice in your own life. The course also has 13 modules of audio and written content teaching you the principles of intuitive eating, plus a private community forum just for course participants, so that you can have daily guidance from me and my team, as well as hundreds of other great people who are on the anti-diet path with you. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. It's a great companion to this podcast because it goes into depth about diet culture and the ways that it harms us, with tons of scientific references and resources to help you make the anti-diet case to the people in your life. It also lays the foundation of intuitive eating and helps you start making peace with food and your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. That's christyharrison.com/book. And by the way, if you've read the book already and loved it, as I know a number of people have, and more people are doing now that they have maybe more time on their hands with the pandemic, I would be so psyched if you left a review on Amazon and/or Goodreads and marked the other 5-star reviews there as helpful. Those reviews help more people discover the book, which helps grow the anti-diet movement and ultimately helps make the world a safer place for people in all size bodies and all shape bodies and all ethnicities and gender identities and all the rest. So thank you for reading this book, or for planning to read the book if you haven't already, and I'm so grateful for all of you for listening. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Taylor Chan. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
I feel like I've been pretty fortunate, and from a young age, I had a really peaceful relationship with food growing up. I was always an athlete, and the focus on food was always, you have to eat in order to fuel your athletic performance and to perform well, and eat in order to be really successful at your sport. And no one really bothered me too much about my food. That probably has to come a little bit with some thin privilege too, just looking quote unquote healthy. But food was really just seen as fuel. We had team dinners and things like that, like pasta parties where you load up before a swim meet. So I had a pretty positive relationship with food growing up. The only food rule that I can really think of is my parents really didn't like food waste. And so they always had like the rule where you had to sit at the table until you finished your plate kind of thing. But I didn't think that was too intrusive in any way. That was just kind of like growing up. It was like, oh, like that's just the way it is. I always have to finish my plate, and that's just it.
So it didn't feel like it interfered in your intuitive eating really at all.
Not too much. I know my sister had a different experience. She hated milk and she would always have to sit at the table. And now she resents milk because she always was sitting there for so long with it. But I don't know. I loved to eat growing up. So I feel like for me, it was always a sense of pride, I guess, to be able to finish my plate just because it was something that was reinforced as being positive. But yeah, I never had an issue with that because I was always able to have a big appetite.
And that's so interesting too, that having a big appetite when you're someone with thin privilege is seen so differently in most cases than when you're someone in a larger body who has a big appetite. It's like night and day. I also had a sense of pride in how much I could eat as a kid and teenager mostly.
Right. And I feel like with that too, it's like people see you eating a lot of food. They see you in a thin body and they're like, oh my gosh, where do you put all of that? I wish I could be like that. And it just really amps that up in your mind to be like, oh my gosh, like I'm doing a good thing. I have a fast metabolism. This is something to really be proud of, which has taken a little bit to kind of unpack in more recent years. But yeah, it was definitely, oh, like look at how much food I can eat, showing off in some sort of sense. But then also as being an athlete, it was encouraged for you to eat a lot and in order to make sure that you're eating enough kind of thing.
Do you feel like you were wedded at all to like the identity of being a smaller person?
That's a great question. Yeah, probably. I mean, I think it's so like people always talk about wanting to be in a smaller body, and it just is, I guess, reinforced in so many subtle ways that, yeah, it's like, oh, like I'm that person that can eat a burger. I'm that person that can eat so many, like, look at how many pieces of pizza I'm eating and I'm still in a thinner body. And yeah, it's definitely part of your identity whenever everyone's congratulating you for it. And it's nothing that I asked for, nothing that I did that was special. That's just the body that I happened to be born into, but you receive a lot of praise for it. And that I think is inherent in thin privilege.
And yeah, it's so messed up too to be praised for something that you have no control over, that you didn't ask for. That praise, I mean, it sounds like for you, it didn't interfere in your relationship with food or your body as a younger person. I'm curious to hear how that changed as you got older, but like, you know, it sounds like the compliments weren't as toxic for you then, but I know for a lot of people, those compliments can be so toxic because it's like, oh, I have to retain this identity as a small person. I have to retain this thing that people are praising me for.
Yeah. And I think that it wasn't really toxic to me at that time when I, like during up and through high school, really, because I really wasn't exposed to much of diet culture. It wasn't really until college that I really had my first exposure to diet culture and where I really started questioning my relationship with my food, the way that my body looked, and all those other sort of fun things. I remember pretty vividly my freshman year, we were all sitting in our freshman dorm with a couple of girls that lived on my floor. And one of the girls was bragging about, oh my gosh, all I had today was I was so good today. I was so good. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, like good for you. I ate all these other foods. Like I wish I could have just limited myself to just like maybe I'll try that tomorrow kind of thing. And that's really the first instance where I started thinking like, should I be doing that too? Like I've never had that thought before. And I'm just like, have I been doing this wrong all along? Like, what am I missing out on kind of thing?
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you were so insulated from diet culture up until that point, and that like that first exposure made you feel like, oh my God, is this bad? Is this wrong? Am I doing it wrong? Rather than like, oh, that person's weird.
Right.
Why are they only eating that? It's interesting how diet culture colors that perception.
Yeah, but I think it's also that group mentality. It's like, I wasn't the only person that was like, oh, like, that's weird. That's different. Everyone was all just jumped on and they were like, oh yeah, like, I wish I could do that too. Like, I'm trying to do that too. I'm just like, oh, like, okay, I guess I'm the odd man out on this. Like, how can I get in on this kind of thing? Yeah. And then that I went into college knowing that I wanted to study nutrition. And so, with dietetics classes, you start to learn more food rules. You start to learn how to healthify recipes, choosing only low fat, low sugar, low calorie foods, cooking from scratch. All those things really started to become things that I tried to achieve and internalized in order to prove that, I can be a quote unquote good dietitian. I can be successful in this field because I can follow all these rules that I'm told are ways to achieve health and nutrition.
Oh, gosh. Yes. So many rules. I'm curious, like, how you decided to become a dietitian in the first place. Like, did you know, was it driven by some disordered thinking in your own mind at that time when you decided, or was it totally unrelated?
It was totally unrelated. So I had been accepted to University of Maryland and I needed to decide on a major. So I was literally just scrolling through their website that had the listing of all their majors on there. And I saw that nutrition and dietetics was one of them. And I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like a major where you can just talk about food all the time. And I really love food and I want to talk about food for my job. And I want other people to love food too. And I also didn't realize how much chemistry and biology there would be in it. Otherwise, I might have second guessed it up ahead of time. But yeah, so it was really my love for food. And then also there's a lot of chronic disease in my family. And I saw it as a way in order to be more preventative. So then that way, hopefully myself and my siblings could either reduce our risk, or if we inevitably do get those diseases from genetics and all that sort of stuff, that we would have better quality of life overall moving forward. So I guess saying that out loud, there was that little bit of healthism in it, but the main driver was definitely my love for food.
That's so interesting. It's so innocent, the love for food and wanting other people to love food. It's like, oh, I wish that was what nutrition and dietetics was.
Yeah, it really does seem that way, innocent, but it shouldn't be. And I don't know.
It should just be how things are. I agree.
Right.
With the chronic disease stuff, was there talk in your family of using food to manage disease, or was that something that wasn't really talked about, but that you just had learned from other channels?
I don't know if it was necessarily explicitly talked about. My dad had type 2 diabetes and he was diagnosed with that probably when I was in about 5th grade. And he started, and with that, he was able to not have to manage, he didn't have to check his blood sugars every day. He didn't have to do insulin injections every day. He could just manage it with a small dose of metformin. So I think seeing that, I was just like, oh, food has this really powerful ability in order to not necessarily reverse disease, but again, improve quality of life. And so seeing that he was able to manage his disease so well through food and his lifestyle behaviors, that definitely planted a seed, even though we didn't necessarily talk about it.
It's interesting too how straightforward it sounded for him in the way that it's always made out to be in diet culture. It's well, yeah, just manage it through food and exercise. And he was one of the lucky ones who had that kind of workout. And we know that so many people don't.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because we talk about it sometimes. You talk about, weight stigma and all that kind of stuff. And he was like, oh, well, obviously, if you're in a larger body, then you have a higher risk for disease like diabetes and that kind of stuff. And I just kind of went to him Dad, you were in a thinner body whenever you're diagnosed with diabetes. That just goes to show that weight isn't necessarily an indicator of health. And he was just like, oh. I'm like, yep.
Hadn't thought about it, huh?
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, that's such a powerful example too of type 2 diabetes can strike anyone at any time. It's not just when you're in a larger body.
Right.
So there's this kind of dual, sounds like it was mostly just this love of food and this kind of desire to share that with the world. And then also this sense of healthism a little bit, and that disease could be managed through food, but not as a driving force or as the main force in choosing nutrition.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think once I started taking classes, there was still always that love for food there. But I think that healthism piece really started to kick up, especially because in nutrition classes, all you talk about is how nutrition affects your physical health and all the ways that we can modify our foods or we can restrict certain foods in order to improve our ability to achieve health, or I hate using the word reverse, but reverse or mitigate disease.
Right. Especially that's how it's like framed in diet culture too, I think. Is like reverse your diabetes, reverse your heart disease, like reverse all these things. And so that is kind of how we believe it is at first.
Right. When it's not necessarily true because some of those diseases just don't go away.
Right. There's nothing you can do to actually reverse them.
Yeah. But once I started taking all those college classes, I really started to take on those roles and responsibilities. I'll call them roles and responsibilities for myself in wanting to be able to preserve my health and achieve health. And again, show that I will be a really successful dietitian because I can do all these things that were taught in class. So that's really when I started to devote a lot of my time to researching, okay, like how can I make this food a little bit healthier? How can I trick my family into thinking that this food tastes good? Spending a lot of time in those health food aisles, buying super expensive ingredients like chia seeds and quinoa, nutritional yeast, and tons of kale, which after I discovered intuitive eating, I'm like, I really, really don't like kale and I don't have to eat it, which is great.
You never have to eat it.
No, but yeah, so I just spent a lot of time. And the funny thing is I spent all this time in the kitchen trying to make scratch food because scratch cooking is the gold standard and whatever, but none of my food ever turned out well. And it was always kind of a shock to me because all of the bloggers that I would get my recipes from, they'd be like, oh, like these are healthified foods, but they taste just like the real thing. They're just way better for you. And I'm like, oh, okay. So then I would follow the recipe to a T. I would make it. And then it would taste like crap. I'd be like, oh my gosh, what's going on here?
That's interesting that your culinary sense kind of got flagged. You were like, wait a minute, what's going on?
Yeah. And again, I think it's like one of those things that you take internally. You're just like, oh, like I can't follow this recipe. I must not be very good at cooking after all. This is all on me. This is my fault. And you create that sort of guilt and shame. Like, am I not capable?
Never thinking to blame the recipe, right? Never thinking like,
no.
They say it's going to taste just as good, but actually it doesn't because you can't take out all the fat or whatever it is and have it still taste good.
Right. I just remember making these chocolate chip cookies that I think you put like the chickpeas in them and just minimal flour and chocolate chips. And I like ate the whole batch, which do not recommend because that does some weird things to your GI. But I would eat the whole thing. I'm just like, okay, like they're going to taste better if I keep eating more of them. And it just never tasted better. And just like, oh, I just ate chickpeas. And that was the most miserable experience of my life.
Oh, seriously. I have actually been talking to a friend recently about like the horrors of chickpea desserts, like specifically because she has someone in her family who does a lot of chickpea desserts and is always like, why are you doing this to me? Like, I don't like them. And yeah, it's just not good. And it's funny that trend of like healthifying, quote unquote, healthifying dessert, because it's not really what health benefits are you really getting from having beans in your cookies? Unclear. Tastes like crap. That's that's one thing you get from it. It's not a benefit.
Right. And then it's also like, oh, like what's wrong with me for not liking this healthy food? Like, do I not like healthy food? Does that mean that I need to force myself to continue to eat it until I do like it? There's that like whole spiral of thinking that you just get into.
And it sounds like you really had such a good culinary sense going into it and you loved food and you had always like had such a decent relationship with food and appreciated food. So to be questioning yourself like that must have been really destabilizing.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that looking back on it, obviously I see a lot more of it than I actually did while I was there. But yeah, I definitely spent a lot more time thinking about food and being stressed out about food and wondering why things weren't going wrong, I guess, because things had always been going well for me around food. But then also questioning the way that I ate growing up too, being like, was that not the right thing to do? Should I have been doing better? And then also just thinking about the fact, like, will I have to be eating like this for the rest of my life?
Oh, God. Sounds awful.
Yeah, yeah. And I can imagine like all the people that I made eat my food and they're like, oh yeah, like it tastes so good. But you guys are all dirty, dirty liars. Ugh, just trying to be nice. It's fine.
So you are like proselytizing to people in your life, it sounds like, trying to be like, let's eat the healthified version of this. It's great.
Yeah, every time I would come home, I would make a meal for my family. And I remember one time in particular there, I was making tacos, but instead of ground beef, I did some weird like tofu crumble, black bean, and it just like was not good. And then another time I came home and I made the same thing, or I made tacos again, but I made it with like ground turkey. And everyone in my family was eating that a second time. And they're like, is this real meat or is this like some like weird food that you tried to make for us? And I was like, oh no, like it's actually like turkey this time. It's really good. Like that's what tastes good. And everyone was just, I guess, a little skeptical of me. Like they didn't trust me anymore because I've been trying to trick them with all these foods into eating healthier, quote unquote, healthier. And then it just gave me a sense of like, oh, like they don't really like, they don't really trust me anymore. And that was kind of a moment for me to step back and be like, okay, like what am I doing here?
It's really sad. It like disconnected you from them, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was isolating for sure, especially since it seems like this was a priority for me in my life. Why isn't this a priority for anyone else?
Yeah, like if they really loved you and wanted to be a part of your life, why wouldn't they prioritize this too?
100%. Yeah.
That's rough. It sounds like they all had pretty decent relationships with food themselves and like weren't about to overhaul their eating to match up with some BS standard of health, supposed health. And they were perfectly happy eating the way they had always eaten, but you were the one starting to question things. And so it kind of drove a wedge between you.
Yeah. And, whenever you're like college age, you think you know everything. But whenever you're in school learning about nutrition, you're just like, oh my gosh, like I'm the expert of nutrition. I know what's best for all of us, which we know now that you have to trust people to be the experts of themselves and really delve into like all those different aspects of their life to figure out what's actually best for them and help them figure that out. But yeah, it was just me trying to almost exert control or also just proving my expertise as an upcoming nutrition professional and how much I know and how much I'm trying to help them.
I think that's so common among dietitians to be and nutrition professionals to be of all kinds. Like I completely identify with that. And I think a lot of us have gone through that too, of like trying to be the nutrition expert for everyone in your life and thinking that that was the way to like prove yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not all about me. And that's why
Mhm.
that's what we find out through intuitive eating and health at every size and all that other good stuff.
Yeah, it's like we're just there to shepherd people into connecting with themselves, and then we can go away and not like tell them what to do anymore or at all, not tell people what to do ever.
Right, right. Just helping guide people.
I'm curious how that shift started to happen for you then. Was the taco mistrust moment kind of a wake-up call for you in terms of like, oh God, my family doesn't trust me. Like, is there something wrong with what I'm doing? Or was it did it like drive you further into the healthism?
I'm a little fuzzy on the timeline, but the first time that I was ever introduced to intuitive eating was the summer before my junior year. I had gotten an internship with the University Health Center as a nutrition coach under the guidance of the registered dietitian there. And Intuitive Eating, the book, was one of our summer reading assignments before we started. So thinking back, it was like I was very fortunate to have been exposed so early on in my career, just to pull myself out a little bit earlier. But yeah, so that was the first time that I was really introduced to intuitive eating. And at the time, the book really made sense to me. It was like, okay, like, yeah, it makes sense. You should eat when you're hungry, not when you're full. You should listen to the satisfaction factor and, shut up the food police and all that kind of stuff. That all made a lot of sense to me. And I think that's where it made sense to me, but I wasn't ready to apply it yet to my own life in certain ways. So I was one of those people who was really what they call straddling the line between intuitive eating and I guess traditional MNT. And I had a really black and white understanding of intuitive eating, where you take some of the principles, particularly the hunger fullness scale, and say like, okay, like if I'm not hungry, then I can't eat. Or if I'm feeling full, then I must stop eating. Or if I'm not in the mood for that, then I can't have that right now.
Right. Just basically turning intuitive eating into a diet.
Right, right. So I read the book. It was really great, but I just had a very black and white understanding of it. And I was really trying to figure out where medical nutrition therapy fit into all of this because, all of that's so entrenched in so many different rules and guidelines. And so it's like, is intuitive eating only for healthy people, or can people managing diseases also practice intuitive eating too? And so there's just a lot of contradictions between what I was learning in school and what I had read in this book. But that's when I first started my Instagram. And it was, food-based Instagram, post pictures of all the food that I was eating and how I was making them healthier, but showcasing things like pizza and cookies and showing like, oh, like I still eat pizza and cookies, but I do it in a healthy way. And that's intuitive eating. And that's when I really started promoting myself as intuitive eating RD2B on my Instagram profile, even though I was still living with a lot of food rules and some of those emotions that get mixed up whenever we are eating food.
That's so interesting. So it was like this fence-straddling approach to intuitive eating and sort of dietification of intuitive eating, like the diet culture version of it. But it sounds like maybe coming out of, you needed that fence straddling moment. I mean, I often say like, you can't get over a fence without straddling it, unless you like just do a running leap or something, I guess. But I think most people just kind of step over it. So like, of course, you're going to need to straddle it at a certain point. It sounds like it was helping you in a way to come out of the diet culture stuff.
Yeah, it was a stepping stone for sure. I think that everyone just goes through that phase where it's like, oh, like I hear this stuff. I just need some time to sit with it because I don't really fully grasp the concept. And also, you're hearing so much contrasting information that how can this be true if all of this is also true? So I kind of sat in that space for several years and still called myself intuitive eating and was really just trying to figure out how can I balance these two worlds that I'm really interested in and I feel passionate about. I don't think that anyone should feel guilty around food. And I think that everyone, again, should be able to enjoy food. Like that's why I got into the profession. So really finding a way to balance the traditional nutrition with what I was learning through intuitive eating. And that transformation, I guess, didn't really happen until like 3 years later, whenever I was in grad school and I had a roommate who was also interested in intuitive eating, but we really hadn't done much of the work behind it yet. So we were both kind of in that fence straddling area, but I think we were both ready to try to delve a little deeper into it, try to figure out some of the nuances behind there, especially as we were going through grad school classes and our internship experiences and seeing how things like intuitive eating were playing out in real life. And that's what like health at every size and everything like that too.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you were like, you knew enough to know you wanted to learn more and you wanted to delve into it deeper.
Yeah, we knew enough that it felt that telling people not to eat certain foods was definitely wrong. And that recommending that someone go on a low calorie diet just because they had a high BMI, but with no other information we knew about them, putting them on a low calorie diet, that was wrong. But we just needed to figure out a little bit more about the information and the nuances behind it and we spent so many nights talking it out, going through all the different things that we learned in our internship, following more people on Instagram, watching more videos, and just really trying to straighten it all out and get over to the other side of the fence.
You basically did a little crash course for yourselves in intuitive eating and HAES, kind of a little seminar almost.
Yeah. And the way that our grad school classes were set up, we were actually allowed to choose one of the topics that we wanted one of our classes to be based on. And no one else had any ideas. So me and Sydney were like, oh, like, let's do a class on intuitive eating. So we did a whole class where everyone read through the book. And after each chapter, we all sat down and discussed the book. And we had actually Rachel Hartley, we had her call in and give us kind of an overview of what she does and how she applies intuitive eating. And that's really where I first heard that term straddling the fence. And that really just set off a light bulb. Is like, oh, like that's where I am right now. And just kind of give a clearer path to, okay, like, so there is one side. Well, I don't want to say one side or the other, because that sounds like we're pitting each other against each other. But there really is another side to things. And that there is a way to fully embrace that other side of things in a way that is still ethical and makes us effective as a practitioner, but just not in the traditional sense that we had learned through school.
Right. I mean, it's so interesting too to think about that, because I feel like what we're taught, I just had to do my 5-year continuing education units were like up, and I had one unit left that had to be one on ethics. So I just took this little like ethics webinar for the Commission on Dietetic Registration. It was like so interesting to go through, like it went through every element of our code of ethics and talked about like what it meant and sort of what the applications for that might be. And with every single one, I was like, this applies to HAES so beautifully. Like this HAES exemplifies this code of ethics. HAES exemplifies ethical nutrition work in a way that I don't think traditional dietetics does, because we just don't have the like traditional dietetics, and the weight management approach just doesn't have the same kind of science and the same kind of evidence of lack of harm. It has a lot of evidence of harm that it can cause. So I think just looking at it from that lens, like that ethical lens, I feel like the work we do as HAES and intuitive eating dietitians is so ethical. And if we can bring more people into the fold and more people to understand like exactly why it is so ethical to practice in this way, and that it's not at odds with evidence-based medicine, but actually very much supportive of it, I think that would be amazing. But I think it is so hard for people to step out of the diet culture paradigm and sort of holding on to that belief that not doing weight loss is going to somehow harm people. That I think it takes people a long time, as you described. You know, it can take years of straddling that fence before you get to a place where you're really comfortable embracing intuitive eating.
Yeah. And WIND, the Weight Inclusive Nutrition Dietetics, Heather always starts off by posting the Academy's code of ethics on the screen and talking about like all the things that you just said, just really hitting home the fact that weight inclusive care emphasizes compassion and patient-centered care, and really getting away from all those traditional thoughts in a way that still provides really positive treatment outcomes.
Yeah. And I think more people need to know that. I love that she does that at WIN too, because it really does bring the point home that this is absolutely in line with our code of ethics and what we do as dietitians.
Yeah.
So for you, when you started to realize that, when you realized, oh, I've been straddling the fence and I'm ready to go deeper, what do you think it was, or what sort of amalgamation of things brought you over to that place?
I don't know if there was any one turning point that I was like, oh, like this is the day I'm switching over. I think it was just like a really gradual, continual learning. I was still posting a lot of food on Instagram, but that was becoming really tiresome for me. I felt like it was all performative, because it was all performative. And, you know, people were getting annoyed going out to eat with me. So like, oh, like, why do we have to wait for you to take pictures? Our food's getting cold kind of thing. And it just really wasn't becoming fun anymore, posting pictures of food. I'm like, okay, well, I really like this Instagram space. what else can I do? And that's really where I started to think of like, oh, I really enjoy art and I'm really a visual learner. So by creating doodles, it really helped me to think through some of those tougher conversations that I was constantly having with myself inside my own head, getting them on paper and kind of making flow diagrams and things like that in order to think them out and think them through. And in that time that I started posting some of that stuff, I was added to an Instagram pod with some other RD2Bs at the time. And we were all having some really of those tough conversations in there, thinking through some of the nuances. We could all talk about things that were happening in our internship, things that were happening in our education, and how those things pertain to intuitive eating, health at every size, or working against those things, and what we could do to be better. Because I feel like the internship experience really is a time for you to see how other dietitians are doing things and then figure out, okay, like, what do I want to do whenever I become a dietitian? And so that pod was a really great way for us to just throw ideas around about how we could be better whenever we are in that practitioner space.
I think that's so valuable too, to think about that for any RDs to be who are listening to this, to have that kind of support system while you're going through the internship, because it can be so fat phobic, and depending on where you're doing your internship, which the matching process, you really don't have much control over. And so you kind of have to take what you can get in a lot of cases, can be really antithetical to intuitive eating and HAES. So having a group of people that you can process that with, and that even if you have to like hold your nose and do some activities in your internship that you completely don't agree with, maybe you can plant a seed, or maybe you can just use that as a learning opportunity for like, what do you not want to do when you are in your own practice or in your own job as a dietitian?
Yeah. I think that a lot, or what I see in a lot of the Facebook groups that I'm part of now, is that dietetic interns or people that are in that student space still, they feel the pressure to speak up because they know that things aren't right, but they don't necessarily feel like they're in a position or they feel safe enough to be able to do so. I think that just knowing that, you can do something if you feel comfortable doing it, but also you don't have to, is really reassuring, because again, we feel like we're trying to fight this fight, but it puts a lot of pressure on ourselves to always be expressing that and putting out that energy, when it's like we really have to reserve the energy for ourselves and take care of ourselves as we're working through this.
And especially because the internship is really hard. I remember that as like one of the most grueling years of my life, just in terms of having to get up and go to all these different placements and working with very diverse, sometimes very challenging populations. And it's already a lot of work. It's already a lot of mostly unpaid, unless you are able to get some sweet deal where you get like prior assessed learning, which is something that I was fortunately able to get because my internship program really loved continuing students and older students and people who'd been working out in the world. And that was me. So I was able to get some of my previous nutrition jobs covered for internship hours. But regardless, I still had to do like 6 months of unpaid work. And so it was exhausting. And I think putting on yourself this added mandate to like always be advocating just isn't really practical or kind to yourself, especially when the internship is set up to be so hierarchical and to be like, these are your preceptors, you're learning from them. They hold the key to whether you get your letters after your name or not. And those letters are the key to so much in your career that you need to have if you're going to go on to be a HAES and intuitive eating dietitian and make a big impact in the world. So, I mean, sometimes in some cases, maybe you can fight the system and it's sort of worth thinking through and asking yourself that question. And maybe there's people who are your supervisors who actually are receptive to intuitive eating and HAES, and you can bring a little bit of it in. But I think in a lot of cases, they just aren't, and they're very set in their ways. And, you can only do what you can do.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. But to add on to that, I feel like in the internship, but also just beyond too, with people who are either curious about HAES and intuitive eating, or people that are resistant to it, really approaching everything with curiosity rather than going in headfirst trying to dismantle the system. by asking questions, and you just like, oh, like, why did you choose to do it this way? Like, what if this happened, kind of thing. Just really approaching with curiosity in order to help other people begin to reflect on, like, oh yeah, like, why did I do it that way? Was that the best way really to do it? And hopefully planting those seeds in a way that's a little gentler and a little kinder.
Yeah, totally. That's such an important point. And I think too, like a lot of dietitians who work in the traditional spaces don't know anything or much about disordered eating. And they might welcome someone who has some knowledge of it or just questions about it, where they can be very open and say, like, actually, I'm not really trained in this, and this is not an area of specialization. And so maybe I need to learn more. Or sometimes in those cases, it can be really cool if you have like a preceptor who is open about that and says, like, I see disordered eating clients and I don't really know what to do with them. You can be like, well, I have some knowledge in that. Can I take on those clients? Like, can I be the one to work with them? And if that's possible, if that's a possibility at the organization you're at, not every organization will let you do that, but if you can get into that position, that can be a way to also make change with a really vulnerable population.
Yeah, for sure. And also on a higher level, today I actually got a survey from my undergrad asking for feedback about the dietetics program. And I made sure to include in there, we need more training on eating disordered and disordered eating, particularly because a lot of people that are going through the dietetic process are doing so because they have some sort of disordered eating that got them interested in nutrition in the first place. Or in my case, like, it fueled my disordered eating. But then also addressing things like weight stigma and social determinants of health at a larger capacity, because those things are really so important for nutrition and our overall well-being, but we don't talk nearly enough about them during our schooling.
We really don't. And I wonder if in part it's because the nutrition field wants to, the dietetics field wants to maintain its sense of importance, which I can understand. Like, I think it's fought for a long time to feel legitimate, and it's a largely female-dominated field. And we all know that those tend to be lower paying fields that aren't as legitimized in the eyes of the medical community or the culture at large, And so I think there's a sense of like trying to hold on to this idea that nutrition is the be all end all. Nutrition really is important. It's a very important aspect of health that needs to be like funded and given support and given the importance that it supposedly deserves. And that's antithetical to what we really see in the social determinants of health research, which is like nutrition is kind of not that important. Like, nutrition is just one of many things. But I think the way that we get around that, the way that the dietetics field can kind of move through that, is to say that as health professionals, as people who are helping people with one small aspect of their health, yes, nutrition is a small aspect, but like, we can also help them with so much more if we're educated on how to help people advocate for themselves, how to help people get the, food security that they need and deserve, how to help people get access to different forms of care or different services that they need. Like, we can help them overall. We can help them so much more than if we were to be, as we're trained to do, just prescribing what to eat and like chastising them for not having enough vegetables on their plate or whatever. There's so much more valuable things that we can actually bring to the table if we're trained on that, and if our profession gets behind that and says that, like, yes, we acknowledge that nutrition is just one small piece of the pie, and there's other pieces of the pie we can contribute to as healthcare providers if we're allowed to and if we're given that support.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that although nutrition is just a small piece of that pie, nutrition plays such a big role in all aspects of our health. And then when I say nutrition, I really mean food and the culture around food, the environmental aspects of food, the social aspects of food, the emotional aspects of food. All those things are included in my personal definition of nutrition, because I really want to expand my definition of nutrition to encompass all those things that make us who we are, because, food really does play a role in every single aspect of our life, and we can't live without food. So being able to celebrate all aspects of our life through food, with food, and showing that, I guess, nutrition does play a role in all aspects of our lives, even if it is a small role, because there are other things going on too, I think can really help elevate the profession, showing that, like, oh yeah, we acknowledge that health and wellness are so much bigger than just our physical health, which is what we traditionally think of and learn about.
Right. And yeah, that's such a good point of expanding nutrition to include people's relationships with food, because that is a huge piece of not just physical health, but mental health and overall health and well-being. Having a peaceful relationship with food, not having disordered behaviors around food or disordered thoughts gives us so much more space in our life to take care of ourselves, to pursue the things we want to pursue, to engage in the world in a way that makes us feel fulfilled and rewarded. And that we know also has huge benefits to health and well-being. By contrast, when people are struggling in their relationship with food, when they're eating in a disordered way, when they're governed by restrictive thoughts and fat-phobic thoughts about food and their body, it's not helping their overall well-being. It's only detracting from it. And so as dietitians, we definitely have a huge role to play in that too, of helping people heal their relationships with food and get to a place where they're at peace enough to pursue all the other things that are meaningful in life.
Yeah. And I think it's always just kind of interesting whenever people are like, oh, like, you're a dietitian, what should I be eating? And my response is always, I don't know, like, you tell me, like, what kind of food do you like? What grocery stores do you have access to? What equipment do you have in your kitchen? Like, yeah, I need to know all these other things. It's not just as simple as like, oh, like, eat this, not that. There's so much more to it than just that. But at the same time, nutrition is also really simple in that it doesn't have to be complicated, focusing on all the minutia of all these little things that we get ourselves stuck into.
Yeah, we really don't need to be obsessed with the grams of this and the, amounts of that and like whatever weird chemicals we're obsessed with today and that are going to be different tomorrow. It's not important. What's important is the overall relationship with food. And yeah, that sense of holistic, like, variety and balance and pleasure that we get in food.
Yeah, really taking ourselves out of all the details and really just taking a look at that big picture and how are we functioning in that bigger picture of nutrition.
Right. And yeah, I feel like nutrition, the word nutrition is so granular at this point. It's like people's idea of nutrition really does just focus on like, well, what can I eat and not eat? What can I put on my plate? And what do I have to, like, quote unquote, earn or whatever it is? The disordered beliefs that we have about food are so rampant in this culture. But I feel like nourishment is like a better word for it, actually.
I do really like that word. I always forget about that one.
Yeah, I feel like it sort of encompasses that idea of having enough too, because to me that's like also one of the most important elements of working with anyone around food is like, do you have enough? How can we support you in having enough and not like just enough and no more bullshit idea, diet culture idea of enough, but like actually, abundance, like adequate supply of food that meets all of your needs, your need for pleasure, variety, satisfaction, like joy and safety and comfort, knowing that you have enough food to meet your needs and being able to trust that so that you feel safe. And that is a piece that diet culture takes away from us so rampantly, from all of us. I think it robs us of that sense of safety and security with food. And then especially for people who have food insecurity at the economic level, food insecurity that they have no control over.
Yeah, and all of that diet culture thinking and expectations really do trickle down to the people that are at lower socioeconomic
socioeconomic
status. Oh my gosh, it's been a long day. During my internship, whenever we had a rotation at a low-income clinic, it was like a free service where people could come in and talk to a nutritionist. And the people that were coming in, they're like, I go to the food bank. That's where I get the majority of my food from. But everything there, like, they don't have anything that's low sodium. They don't have anything that's organic. And still, like, taking all those nutrition ideals and being wrapped up in them still, I think seeing that was really high impact for me, because it's like, oh, you have limited access to food and you're still concerned about all of these things that people who have greater access to food and the privilege of nutrition.
Yes. Because when you don't have the basic needs met, thinking about that minutia is just counterproductive, really.
Right.
No, it's so true. I mean, I think about Ellen Satter's hierarchy of food needs, where it's like having enough food, having just basic access to food and having all your food needs met is the base of the pyramid. It's the base of the hierarchy. You can't go anywhere else until you have that foundation. Only when you have those needs met can you start thinking about the other things that get built on top of that, like having pleasurable food, having desirable food, like food that you really enjoy. Then only after kind of those higher needs get met, then maybe you can start thinking about nutrition in a hopefully, gentle nutrition sense of like, what can I do to support my well-being, and foods that will just add to my life and not be detracting and taking away any foods. But that is like the tip of the pyramid that only can exist when all of the bases are there, the foundation being having enough food. So yeah, I also had that experience of working with folks in lower income communities and seeing people like worrying about the fat content of things and sugar content, and are they eating enough vegetables and stuff like that. And I get it, because I think that, we're all told that we're supposed to be doing that. And people of all income levels, all socioeconomic statuses, live in the world and read the news and hear these messages of what we're quote unquote supposed to be eating. So it makes sense for them to be concerned about that, just like everyone in diet culture is. And it is really standing in the way of people getting their basic needs met and getting enough food, which is really the most important thing to start from.
Yeah, and I even see that with some of the intuitive eating stuff too, with folks feeling a little bit left out because they can't participate in intuitive eating because they don't have that basic access to an abundance of food on a consistent basis. And so it really is a privilege also to be able to engage in things like intuitive eating, because you have to have that access to a variety of foods in order to say like, oh, like, is this satisfying for me? Do I have options to find something that is more satisfying? Am I hungry right now? Do I have access to food in order to satiate that hunger?
It's interesting because I think intuitive eating actually can encompass that as well. I think the way that it's been framed and discussed thus far maybe doesn't capture that, but I've been talking and thinking a lot more lately about the fact that like intuitive eating in a situation of food scarcity or food insecurity means just making sure you can get access to food and figuring out ways to get your food needs met. That is intuitive eating for that person who is in that situation. Not like, oh, am I craving chocolate or fruity, flavors or whatever. It's like, we can't think about that right now. It would be nice also if you could get those desires met, but the first order of business is really just making sure you have consistent access to enough food. And again, that Satter's hierarchy of food needs, I think is, Ellen Satter's model is a little different than intuitive eating, but it's very similar in many, many ways. It's like attuned eating, I think it's called, versus intuitive eating. And it's, for all intents and purposes, kind of like the same general ballpark. And I think that incorporating that idea of the hierarchy of food needs into intuitive eating more explicitly would help people feel more included at all socioeconomic levels. Similarly, like I think sometimes people think, and I've even said this before too, that you can't really practice intuitive eating with an eating disorder. I don't say that anymore. I say like you can practice certain principles of intuitive eating with an eating disorder, and you might need to wait until further down the line to practice like the full expression of intuitive eating, including hunger and fullness, because the eating disorder is going to throw those cues off. But you absolutely can practice many of the other principles of intuitive eating, and you can build the groundwork, lay the foundation for yourself to eventually get back in touch with those hunger and fullness cues. Hunger and fullness are not the be-all, end-all of intuitive eating, right? It's like there's 8 other principles beyond those. And I think just making it the sort of diet culture version of intuitive eating is like, you have to eat when you're hungry, and you have to stop as soon as you're full, and you have to eat exactly what you're craving. That excludes so many people. And also that's a diet. So that's not real intuitive eating. So I think we have to like explore and explicate the nuances of intuitive eating and what it really says and what it really means to bring everybody into the fold. Because at the end of the day, what I really believe about intuitive eating is that, and I know Evelyn and Elise say this as well, like it's the way we're all born knowing how to eat. I will say it's the default mode. It's like we don't have to think when we're babies and toddlers. If we are in a situation where there is enough food in those age groups, we will figure it out and we'll nourish ourselves accordingly. And when there's not enough food at a young age, that can definitely interfere with someone's ability to eat intuitively, but they're still capable of doing it. Like once they can overcome that food insecurity and rebuild trust with their body, they can get back to intuitive eating. It's within all of us, and it's all of our fundamental right, really. And diet culture takes it away. Food insecurity takes it away. Poverty takes it away. But like at the end of the day, it's our right and we can reclaim it.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many nuances. And these are the conversations that I love because it really just helps me develop more of an understanding and try to just grasp some of the concepts and some of the nuances and really challenge myself to reflect and think a little bit deeper about some of these concepts. But yeah, my mind is spinning right now. I feel like you just said so much. I'm like, let me think about this.
Yeah. I mean, this is like my next, thing is kind of like trying to push intuitive eating in this direction or, bring intuitive eating along in this direction that is just more explicitly inclusive. Because I think it is like at its core, at its fundamental level, it totally is an inclusive practice. It's just the way that it gets translated and the way that it has maybe been explained in the past, like focuses a little too much on the privileged aspects of it and not on the aspects that are universal and particular to people in situations of scarcity also.
Yeah, I think it just goes to show that, like this whole journey through like intuitive eating and health at every size is really just this like one big convoluted mess. And everyone is going through this at their own rates, and just being able to kind of meet people where they're at whenever they are trying to learn about intuitive eating and health at every size can be really helpful, because some people might not be ready to talk about all these higher level concepts. Well, maybe they're not higher level. I don't know.
But the nuances, yeah.
Yes, the nuances. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. People have to kind of start where they are. And I think the first step out of it is just exploring like how diet culture hasn't worked for you, or how some of the early stages of intuitive eating, I think, can look different for different people. But it's like what we both went through with the fence straddling, or being like, okay, I know people need to be able to honor their hunger and their fullness, and like, let me start there. And then building on top of that. But I think it's also like so heartening to know that people like you and I and so many of our colleagues have been there and have gone through it and are continuing to learn and are continuing to evolve our understanding of these concepts. We didn't just stop and ossify at the fence straddling place. We kept going. And there's so much richness when you can keep going.
Yeah, and I think with that too, it can be really intimidating. I think whenever you are new to the space and you are trying to figure things out, especially if you do have a social media presence, to be able to put things out there with the fear of getting things wrong or saying things the wrong way or not addressing a nuance in a correct way. We always see things from our own lens, but I think it can be really paralyzing sometimes to actually put our voices out there just because we're afraid of the lashback that we're potentially going to get. But I think just like giving ourselves compassion and grace through this learning process, because it is just this nonstop learning process as we continue to figure things out, and, just admitting that, yeah, like sometimes I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. It's okay to be wrong. And, the only way that you can know if you're wrong is if someone tells you, and then you grow from that and you learn from that.
Well, that's also really great to hear from you as someone who publicly evolved your Instagram and your social media stuff. It sounds like you were active on social media when you're in that fence straddling place, and then you came more towards health at every size and intuitive eating as you went along. And what have you learned from that process in terms of curating your social media, shifting course, and, having a presence, but also being a human who's evolving?
I don't know everything. As much as I would love to believe that I know everything and I have it all down pat, I really don't. And there are just so many different things, especially when it comes to race and financial insecurity and things like that, because I live with a lot of privileges coming from like an upper middle class family that had a stable home, stable family growing up. that a lot of things that I didn't have to think about, that when I do put stuff out there, sometimes I do get call-ins, sometimes nice, sometimes not so nice, but either way, it doesn't matter, because one of the things I've really learned is that it's always impact over intention. Like, I can put something out there with the best of intentions, but if people are being harmed by that, then it doesn't matter what I was intending. It's what actual influence does it have on the people that are seeing this. And I think that's really been one of my biggest takeaways. So moving forward, whenever I am creating content and writing my captions and all that stuff, I think about all those times where I have had call-ins in the past. I'm like, okay, what can I do to make my content more inclusive, and acknowledging the fact that there are so many nuances here.
And I think that iterative process is so helpful too, right? Of putting something out there, seeing how it lands with people, and then refining your message or shifting your message because of that. Adding to it, adding nuance to it, adding layers to it based on the feedback that you hear from people who are coming from very different backgrounds.
Yeah. And I think too, whenever I first started out on social media, it was like, oh, content, content, content. Need to come up with new ideas, new things, need to put stuff out there in order to stay relevant, which I'm sure you know too.
Oh, yes.
But in doing that, it was creating a lot of stress and taking away a lot of fun from Instagram, which is really something, like, Instagram is a fun hobby for me. It's something that I really enjoy. But I also want to be able to put out really thoughtful pieces that are well thought through. So being okay with slowing down my process, not forcing content if it's not there, and giving myself time to develop ideas. So whenever I put out content, it's normally ideas that I've been thinking about for months, and I just haven't had the chance to really fully develop a thought to actually put it out there yet. Like, I have a whole list of things, of ideas, but either I don't feel well equipped enough to actually speak to it, so I have to do more research, or it's just something that I really want to be intentional about when I do post and how I post it.
That's so awesome to hear. And I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think in this day and age of the churn of social media and feeling like we have to be putting things in the feed all the time, it's really so valuable to just slow down. And that's something that I've had to do myself as well. Just like be realistic with how much I can produce in a given week or day without dropping the ball, and wanting to make sure that I'm giving things my most thoughtful approach, rather than just like, oh, I got to put something up now.
Right. Yeah. And especially whenever there's always that comparison factor on social media. You can't get away from it. But whenever you're seeing people that are churning out content constantly, I'm just like, oh my gosh, how are you doing this? Like, I'm falling behind. But being able to take breaks from social media, being able to give yourself breaks from creating content, and I don't know, sometimes you get stuck in that rut where you're like, oh my gosh, I literally have no ideas, and all the ideas that are coming to mind aren't impactful or don't feel authentic. And it's like, okay, then what's the point of putting out content? Just take a step back and go focus on other things in life, because, you know, nutrition's not the only aspect of my life. There's so many other things that I like to do. Why don't I focus on those things and hope that maybe some sort of inspiration will flow in? And if not, that's okay. You know, Instagram's not life as much as it seems like it is.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely can have real life impacts, but it's not the whole of your life. And I agree. I have so many things that I care about and love to do other than this work. And I feel like the more time I spend doing those other things, the more it actually enriches my work when I come back. Making connections with things outside of this field is super important to me, and I feel like helps feed my creativity.
Yeah, 100%. I love that word, enriches.
Yeah, it really does. It's like adding compost to the soil or something. It's just like it gives it something new.
Yeah.
Oh, so good to talk with you. I feel like we could talk forever, and like this whole creativity conversation is like a whole other thing that I would love to riff on some more later. But in the meantime, tell us where people can find you online and learn more about your work.
My main place that I am online is on Instagram. You can find me at Food and Fearless. And then if you like my work there, you can also buy prints of them at foodandfearless.com.
So awesome. We'll put links to that in the show notes too. And I need to get some prints for my office. I feel like my walls are pretty bare these days. So thank you so much for coming on. It's really great talking with you.
Yeah, thanks, Christy, for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Taylor Chan for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe and share at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/238. That's christyharrison.com/238. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs, and I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.